So we want to get to today's major Supreme Court rulings. The Supreme Court is knocking down President Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court also upheld state laws that ban transgender athletes from playing on girls' sports teams. Joining us now is Washington correspondent Karen Kaifa to break down the court's final opinions. Thanks for joining us. I want to talk first about the mix of conservative and liberal justices that really made up this majority ruling in favor of upholding birthright citizenship. Talk about what that looks like.
Yeah, Marcella, this case was surrounding an executive order President Trump made in the very early days of his presidency that really wanted to rethink the idea of birthright citizenship, or anyone born on U.S. soil would be considered a U.S. citizen. He wanted to make it so that at least one parent of that child would either have to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. And so when the arguments came around this to the court in April, after this order was stalled in just about every lower court it encountered, President Trump found this so important that he actually attended those Supreme Court arguments, unprecedented for a sitting U.S. president. But you could hear, Marcella, back in April, conservative and liberal justices expressing some skepticism of a rather narrow interpretation of the 14th Amendment that the Trump administration was leaning on. Today, that played out in this majority opinion that was written by the Chief Justice John Roberts. He rebuffed this idea of that narrow interpretation, saying there was very little evidence of it in the decades since the 14th Amendment was put into place. The broad definition of citizenship and who is entitled to it in the 14th Amendment was intentional. So the court ruling against President Trump in that particular case, Marcella.
Yeah, and children's advocates, we know that they argue that ending birthright citizenship might impact health care for all newborns. What were some of the biggest concerns there?
Yeah, this was something that kind of went under the radar for most, but really advocates for babies and children were very concerned about the health impact that this could have. If you listen to the arguments back in April, you heard justices like Ketanji Brown Jackson ask how this would actually be implemented. She said, would you have to have the parents hand over their citizenship documentation in the delivery room? And the concern among a lot of advocates for children and babies was that that documentation was going to stall some of the critical preventative care and urgent care that takes place in the very earliest stages of life, of babies coming into the world. Certain tests that are conducted, certain inoculations, certain care that gets taken would be stalled by that process of verifying the citizenship of the parents who came in with the baby. But of course, that is not a concern now. Birthright citizenship, as we have known it really for more than 100 years, stays because of that 6-3 majority opinion by the court released this morning.
And I want to get to the opinion that came down this morning as well, the ban on transgender youth in sports. We know the focus was on West Virginia and Idaho this term, but there are other states that have similar bans in place. What does it mean for states and for areas across the country with this ruling?
Yeah, Marcella, there's actually more than 24 states that have similar laws that are on the books, most of them put in place since 2020 or so, when this topic of conversation really started to get going. Supporters of these bans say it's about competition and fairness, and those who do not support these bans say it's discrimination. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote for the conservative majority on the court in that majority opinion. Not surprising, since in the arguments he brought up several times his experience in coaching youth sports. This case means that similar challenges to similar laws based on the 14th Amendment or Title IX would be rejected. The Supreme Court has made that ruling in these cases, and that will pertain to these other state bans if they're argued in a similar way. Transgender advocates are particularly concerned about the direction the court has taken when it comes to laws that pertain to transgender youth, particularly vulnerable at that stage of their lives. Last term, the court upheld a Tennessee law restricting gender transition care for minors. So advocates disappointed in this ruling and some that have come before it in the last 5 years or so, after a decade or so of making some progress.
All right, major decisions coming out of the Supreme Court today. Washington correspondent Karen Kaifa, thanks so much for your insight.